By early 1945, Allied doctrine was clear, rigid, and deeply scarred by experience. Every advance in Northwest Europe was meant to move at the speed of supply. Fuel dumps came first. Ammunition followed. Repair units, bridging equipment, medical stations, traffic control points each had its place in the sequence. Only when the logistical spine was secure were frontline units expected to push forward in force. This method had been drilled into commanders since Normandy, reinforced by painful reminders during the rapid breakout in France, when speed had outrun gasoline and entire armored divisions had been forced to stop cold. Allied planners. Logistics were not a supporting function. They were the campaign. Maps at headquarters were layered with color-coded routes showing supply priorities. Red lines for fuel convoys, blue for ammunition, black for maintenance recovery. Timetables estimated consumption rates down to the hour. Every mile of advance was calculated against the ability to keep tanks fueled, guns firing, and trucks running. Overextension was not just a risk, it was a sin. Senior commanders believed that speed without supply invited disaster. A fast-moving spearhead that lost fuel became a stationary target. An armored column without ammunition turned into dead weight. A unit that advanced beyond repair support could lose half its strength to breakdowns without ever meeting the enemy. The doctrine was conservative by design, born from the fear of catastrophic exposure, and it had worked. Methodical pressure had ground German forces down across France and Belgium. Even the failures like the supply crisis of September 1944 had reinforced the lesson. Discipline in logistics preserved combat power. Recklessness squandered it. This mindset dominated Allied planning rooms as winter gave way to early spring. Then Patton began to move. Reports from Third Army started to disrupt the neat symmetry of the planning charts. Armored spearheads were advancing farther than scheduled. This was treated as routine enthusiasm. Patton had a reputation. Aggression was expected. Headquarters staff assumed his movements would naturally slow once logistical roads would clog. When fuel allocations lagged, Patton redistributed internally, stripping rear echelons to keep lead elements moving. Ammunition consumption was managed by selective engagement rather than pauses. This bordered on heresy. Fuel dumps were being bypassed, timetables ignored, operational boundaries blurred. From within, a spearhead cut off by its own momentum. A sudden counterattack against an exposed flank. A single destroyed bridge, halting an entire army miles beyond resupply. Patton's pace threatened the balance they believed kept armies alive. Meetings at higher headquarters increasingly focused not on German intentions, but on Patton himself. Staff officers debated how long Third Army could sustain its tempo. Traffic controllers reported congestion as convoys raced to keep up with units never meant to be that far forward. Every warning carried the same implication. This cannot continue. Yet the battlefield kept delivering uncomfortable facts. German resistance was collapsing faster than projections. Enemy units were retreating in disarray, not organizing counterstrokes. Roads were being captured intact. Fuel dumps were being seized before shortages became critical. Patton was not outrunning supply in the way doctrine imagined. He was bending it. Each successful day made intervention harder. Every mile gained without disaster undermined the assumption that strict sequencing was the only safe path. What doctrine labeled reckless exposure was, in practice, generating operational shock. Still, the concern remained visceral. One failure, one empty fuel tank at the wrong moment, could turn momentum into catastrophe. Allied commanders understood that luck and enemy weakness were not plans, not the best. But Patton was betting on something doctrine did not quantify. That speed itself could become protection. As Third Army surged forward, the question hanging over Allied command was no longer whether the doctrine was sound. It was whether the situation on the ground had evolved faster than the doctrine designed to control it. Patton's pace did not just challenge German defenses, it challenged the intellectual foundation of Allied operational control. And if it failed, the consequences would not be theoretical. They would be written in burning vehicles, stranded divisions, and the kind of defeat doctrine was built to prevent. The first warnings did not come from the front, they came from the rear. From desks stacked with requisition forms, convoy schedules, and consumption charts that no longer aligned with reality. supply officers began to notice gaps that could not be explained by clerical delay or optimistic reporting. Fuel tallies dipped below projected reserves. Ammunition drawdowns accelerated beyond planned rates. The numbers were unmistakable. Third Army was burning fuel faster than the system could replace it. Convoy commanders reported delays almost as soon as they departed. Roads shattered by months of bombing and winter freeze-thaw cycles choked movement. Bridges rated safe 1 week elapsed under repeated heavy loads the next. Traffic jams stretched for miles as supply columns, refugee flows, and returning wounded competed for the same narrow routes. Drivers slept in their cabs, engines idling when fuel allowed, freezing when it did not. A single broken-down truck could halt an entire column. Recovery vehicles were already overtasked, pulled forward to support Patton's pace. Leaving fewer assets to clear the rear. Each delay magnified the next. Fuel that was supposed to arrive at dawn reached forward depots. By nightfall, fuel meant for nightfall slipped into the following morning, and some never arrived at all. Ammunition officers faced their own reckoning. Artillery expenditure tables were revised downward, then revised again. Units were instructed to conserve, to engage only confirmed targets, to avoid prolonged fire missions. Tank crews were quietly told to rely more on maneuver than firepower if possible. These were not catastrophic shortages. Yet, but they were trending in only one direction. Staff officers began submitting increasingly urgent memoranda to higher headquarters. The language was professional, measured, and unmistakably anxious. Armored spearheads, they warned, were operating at the edge of sustainment. A single disruption, a destroyed bridge, a sudden enemy stand, a weather shift could immobilize entire formations. Immobilization was not a neutral condition. An armored division without fuel was not merely stopped, it was vulnerable, fixed in place, dependent on a shrinking perimeter, unable to disengage quickly if threatened. Doctrine had taught them this lesson repeatedly, written in the wreckage of earlier campaigns. Headquarters could not ignore these reports. Briefings grew tense. Maps showed Third Army units projecting forward like a spear tip, while the logistical tail stretched thinner behind them. Planners traced lines with their fingers, measuring distances from fuel dumps to forward elements. The margins were shrinking. The debate was not theoretical. If momentum continued, someone would have to make a decision. Some officers argued that this was precisely the moment to slow down. The Germans were reeling, but not yet finished. A pause to consolidate would restore balance. Fuel stocks could catch up. Ammunition reserves rebuilt. Repair units repositioned. The army would remain dangerous rather than daring. Others saw something else. They pointed to the enemy's collapse. German units were surrendering in groups. Defensive lines dissolved before contact. Resistance was sporadic, local, and poorly coordinated. Every day of speed was costing the enemy options they would never regain. To halt now, they argued, was to give the enemy time to regroup, time to re-establish command, time to harden positions ahead. The room divided not by rank, but by philosophy. Was momentum itself a resource worth risking supply to preserve? Or was it an illusion, a temporary advantage, masking an approaching logistical cliff? Patton's headquarters, for its part, acknowledged the warnings without conceding the premise. Internal adjustments were made. Fuel was concentrated forward. Non-essential movements were cut. Units were instructed to capture enemy depots intact whenever possible. Risk was not, then it was managed aggressively. From the rear, this looked reckless. From the front, it looked necessary. As debates continued, the clock kept moving. Fuel gauges ticked downward. Convoys crawled forward under blackout conditions. Every hour that passed without a German counterstroke strengthened Patton's argument. Even as it validated the supply officers' fears, no one could deny the danger anymore. The question consuming headquarters was whether the danger was already unavoidably, whether stopping now would simply trade one kind of risk for another. The warnings from the rear were clear, detailed, and increasingly urgent, but the battlefield, indifferent to doctrine and debate, continued to reward speed. As long as that remained true, the decision to intervene grew harder with every mile gained. The order did not arrive as a dramatic reversal or a defiant proclamation. It arrived as continuity. Movement schedules remained intact. Advance axes were reaffirmed. Recon elements were told to keep pushing. Armored spearheads received no instruction to pause, no directive to consolidate. Whatever debates were happening behind desks and map boards, they did not translate into restraint at the front. Patton's Third Army kept moving. Fuel warnings were acknowledged, lugged, and worked around rather than obeyed. Operational priority shifted quietly but decisively. Sustainability was no longer the governing principle. Exploitation was. Every hour of movement was treated as an opportunity to collapse. What remained of German cohesion before it could re-form? Units advanced with margins so thin they barely existed. Tank battalions rolled forward with just enough fuel to reach the next objective, and little confidence beyond that. Infantry rode on vehicles that mechanics warned should already be sidelined. Artillery followed at extended intervals, sometimes firing fewer missions, not because targets were absent, but because ammunition was being husbanded for emergencies that everyone sensed were coming. This was no longer a balanced advance, it was a calculated gamble. Staff, officers within Third Army were not blind to the danger. Situation reports openly acknowledged the risk of isolation. Forward units were operating beyond the comfortable reach of supply dumps. Radio traffic reflected concern that a sudden German stand, even a limited one, could cut routes and trap spearheads far ahead of supporting formations. Patton accepted this. In his view, immobilization was a risk only if the enemy retained the ability to exploit it. What he saw ahead were not coherent defensive lines, but fragments. German formations, withdrawing without coordination. Command posts abandoned faster than they could be re-established. Units surrendering not because they were surrounded, but because they no longer believed relief existed. Speed was doing what firepower could not. It was denying the enemy time to think. Columns advanced through towns that intelligence had marked as potential strongpoints, only to find them undefended or held by small rearguard elements. Roadblocks were brushed aside. Bridges fell intact more often than not. German fuel depots, untouched by retreating units, were seized and immediately redistributed forward. Each captured depot bought another day. Each day gained made the warnings from the rear harder to justify. Momentum fed itself. Success validated risk. The farther Third Army pushed, the more German resistance seemed to dissolve ahead of it. Units that doctrine assumed would require deliberate assaults collapsed after brief contact or fled entirely. Prisoner counts climbed faster than escort units could be assigned. This was not the enemy. Allied planners had prepared to fight. It was an enemy unraveling under pressure it could not process. Yet the danger did not disappear. It merely shifted. As spearheads advanced, gaps opened behind them. Lines of communication stretched thin across hostile territory. A single, effective counterattack, a coordinated armored thrust into the flanks, could still sever the advance and create isolated pockets of American troops far from support. The map showed it clearly. Patton saw it and chose to proceed anyway. Him stopping carried its own fatal risks. A pause would signal hesitation. It would allow German commanders time to rebuild coherence, to establish blocking positions, to mine roads and prepare demolitions. What looked like prudence on paper could become paralysis in reality. Speed, he believed, was now the safest option. Available. Orders reflected this mindset. Units were told to live off captured supplies where possible. Non-essential equipment was left behind. Commanders were encouraged to press through light resistance rather than deploy methodically against it. The advance became leaner, sharper, more exposed. It also became faster. German attempts to respond lagged behind the pace of events. Reports sent up the chain described American columns appearing in areas believed 6 hours earlier. Orders to form defensive lines arrived after those lines had already been crossed. Communications failures multiplied as headquarters displaced repeatedly, never quite catching up with the front. For the Germans, the front ceased to be a line. It became a series of shocks. For the Allies watching from higher command, the situation grew more uncomfortable by the day. Third Army was achieving results that contradicted established planning assumptions. It was succeeding in conditions where doctrine predicted failure, and it was doing so while violating the safety margins that senior commanders believed essential. This created a problem that could not be solved by charts or regulations. If Patton was stopped and the advance stalled, responsibility would fall on those who intervened. If he continued and disaster followed, responsibility would fall on those who allowed it. Every mile gained increased the potential reward and the scale of possible loss. Out in front, none of this debate was visible. Tank crews focused on fuel gauges, infantry focused on crossroads, recon units focused on what lay beyond the next rise. Everyone sensed they were operating at the edge of something undefined, where success and catastrophe were separated by hours, not days. The advance was no longer testing German resistance alone. It was testing the idea that logistics were the ultimate governor of war. Patton was wagering that, for a brief window, speed itself could replace supply. That captured fuel, collapsing enemy morale, and relentless pressure could sustain movement long enough to break the enemy's capacity to respond. It was a wager no doctrine endorsed and once made. It could not be withdrawn without consequence. The reports reached Eisenhower in layers, not as a single revelation. Morning briefings spoke of ground gained, towns secured, enemy formations dissolving faster than planners had predicted. Maps showed Third Army's front bulging forward, its spearheads pressing deeper into territory that, only weeks earlier, had been assessed as requiring deliberate phased advance. Then the second layer followed. Logistics summaries, fuel consumption, charts, ammunition, expenditure, tables, communications assessments, noting the increasing distance between forward elements and their supporting echelons. The same maps that showed progress also revealed exposure. Eisenhower saw both at once. On his desk, success and vulnerability existed side by side. The operational gains were undeniable. Patton's advance had cracked open sectors the enemy could no longer defend coherently. German units were surrendering in numbers that exceeded intelligence estimates. The speed of movement was not merely tactical, it was shaping the operational environment, stripping the enemy of time, initiative, and confidence. Yet every mile gained came with a growing risk. Supply lines stretched thinner with each advance, arrow drawn on the map. The further Third Army moved, the more its forward units depended on uninterrupted flow across fragile roads and captured infrastructure. Eisenhower understood this problem intimately. He had built the Allied campaign on the premise that logistics were not a supporting function, but the foundation of success. Speed without supply was not boldness, it was exposure. Briefings grew more pointed. Staff officers emphasized scenarios no one wanted to see, realized. A single destroyed bridge, a coordinated German counterattack exploiting extended flanks, whether turning roads into impassable channels. Any one of these could immobilize spearheads far from support, turning momentum into liability. The danger was not abstract, it was measurable. Eisenhower listened carefully, weighing every warning against what the front was already delivering. The enemy was not counterattacking. German command responses lagged behind events. Defensive lines dissolved before they could be occupied. Every hour Patton advance reduced the enemy's ability to mount the very disruption Eisenhower feared. This was the paradox. The risk that demanded intervention was being reduced by the very action that created it. Stopping the advance would restore logistical balance, but it would also restore German breathing room. It would allow enemy commanders to regroup, reposition, and reassert control. The fragile disarray Patton was exploiting could harden into resistance if given time. Eisenhower understood. The stakes were no longer purely tactical. There was strategic momentum. At this stage of the war was not just about territory. It was about shaping the endgame. Every collapse forced now was one less battle later. Every captured depot, every surrendered division, shortened the war in ways that spreadsheets could not fully capture. And yet, command discipline could not be ignored. Patton's approach challenged the structure Eisenhower was responsible for maintaining. If one army commander could exceed boundaries based on personal judgment, the coherence of the entire Allied effort risked erosion. Initiative had to exist within control, or it became precedent. This was Eisenhower's dilemma. To rein in Patton was safe, orderly, defensible. To allow him to continue was dangerous, unorthodox, and potentially decisive. In private discussions, Eisenhower's tone reflected neither outrage nor enthusiasm. It reflected calculation. He did not deny the gamble. He acknowledged it fully. What troubled him was not that Patton was taking risks, but that those risks were producing results. Faster than anyone had planned for, admiration, reluctant and restrained, entered the equation. He had also seen enough disasters to know how quickly such moments could turn. His response was measured, cautious, and deliberately ambiguous. No. Supply efforts were prioritized to support Third Army without formally endorsing its pace. Contingency plans were reviewed and quietly reinforced. Aware that he was accepting responsibility for its consequences, control was maintained not through direct confrontation. Patton was right about the enemy's fragility, but Eisenhower also knew that wars were not won by instinct alone. They were won by balancing aggression with restraint. For now, the balance tilted forward. The gamble continued, and as long as German resistance remained fractured, alert, and fully aware that history would judge the choice by its outcome, not its intent,